It's Wizards versus Lesbians, a podcast for your ears. Hello and welcome to Wizards versus Lesbians. My name is Isaac.
I'm Alexis.
And today we are talking about This Is How You Lose the Time War by Max Gladstone and Amal Al-Mahtar. Hooray. Would you like to do the plot or shall I?
Red and blue are two time travelers from opposing sides trying to make their future come true. They are secret agent time warriors and opponents. And one day they start a taunting correspondence, which rapidly leads to them falling in love.
Yep. I have very little to add to that. This is...
Also, the writing is very nice. And it's short.
Yes. That goes in the next section, I think.
Yes.
It's mostly an epistolary novel, but not completely, and not really a novel either, more of a novella. An
epistolary novella with some
narrative bits and pieces,
with some narrative inserts.
And the sort of the fun part of the gimmick is that it's clearly one author writing one of the characters and the other author writing the other one of the characters.
Yes. I meant to look up who wrote who.
You can't tell. I'm 99.9%
no. Because here's the thing: is I had a theory, but then Leora told me I was wrong. That the clue is whose name is closest to each bird on the cover.
Well, we'll put a pin in that for the time being, and come back to it when we're discussing the book. For now, are there lesbians in this book?
Yes.
Yes, there are. Are there wizards?
I mean, you could argue that they're both wizards.
Yeah, this is one of those, like, they're both sort of acting in a wizardly way at behest of larger, more
wizardly forces.
Like
Garden and the Commandant are both definitely wizard figures.
Yes, but they're also both women, as are most characters in this book. And Garden and the Commandant are in conflict, so are Red and Blue. Obviously, it's a time war. It's in the title. We're going to say close enough. There are enough themes present here that rooted in this subgenre that makes sense that we're doing it, I would say. Why should you read this book? It's it's a delightful little confection. It's far and away the most romantic book we've done for the series, I would say.
It is. It is the rare Wizards versus Lesbians book which really does sell you on the central romance.
It's kind of this wonderful tennis match where it feels like two writers just like pitching here's a fun setting that I've thought up and I'm going to put that at you, and here's a fun world building idea and I'm going to put that at you, and you get the sort of mutual excitement of that tennis match between all of the weird and wonderful historical or future settings that these characters find themselves in over the course of this book, because they're going back and forth through time and through all of these various different dimensions and alternate realities. And it's just a lot of fun. And as you pointed out earlier, it is very short. It's just sort of it just sort of melts on your tongue,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it zooms right by.
Yep. Anything to add there on the why should you read it front?
For something so short, it's surprisingly dense and rewards rereading. There's a lot of things that you can, and especially what's really impressive about it, I think, is that for something that is co-written by two people, it's really well constructed and, densely interwoven. And that, that's hard for even one writer to do. So it's particularly impressive that two writers did it. But also, it means that it holds up well on reread. I think I've read it like 4 or 5 times at this point.
Agreed. This was my second read, and I definitely caught a bunch of stuff that I hadn't on my first read, which, again, very impressive. And it's paced really well. Yeah, no, I would struggle a little bit harder to come up with why shouldn't you read this book stuff.
If you dislike, pretty writing that's a little bit, literary or
little flowery,
in,
little purple
in places,
it's purple prose. Red and blue together make purple prose.
Yeah.
Hooray.
Well done.
Thanks.
Yay.
Isaac made a joke.
I mean, I don't think that it is actually particularly purple. I think that it's pretty restrained.
Yeah, agreed.
It has a good sense of humor about it. But I think that people who really want their science... I think if you really want your queer spec fic to be sort of extremely simple and happy, then...
Why are you listening to this podcast?
Yeah, right. Honestly. So, yes. But if your friend, if you have a friend who's like that, perhaps, don't recommend any of the books we cover in this podcast to them.
But yeah, no, I guess that if I were to pick at that thread, I would be like, it can be a little pretentious in spots, this one, I think it has the chops to back it up, but you might not.
Right. I think it pulls it off, without slipping into being pretentious, but I think everyone's tolerance for that is sort of different. And we're kind of reaching here. Like, I'm sure that there are people who dislike this book, but
if I had to come up with a thing about this book to nitpick for nitpicking's sake, it would be that it picks up ideas to use basically as set dressing, which are, you might not like being treated so lightly, like the basically a lot of the colonial, anti-colonial stuff it uses are just sort of, obviously there's not like the space or the opportunity to really develop them, but it sort of drops some like, ooh, what if Cortez died at the hands of the, Incan Empire? Isaac got the Aztecs and the Incas mixed up. You'd think he'd be embarrassed by this massive fuck up, but no.
There's two separate time strand mentions of giving the South Americans resistance to European superbugs.
Yeah, which
either through carefully seeded tailored viruses, or possibly just through setting up trade with Asia.
Right, and if for example they had included, we're going to make sure that all of the Jews in Eastern Europe, had super strength or something like that, I might find that a little bit, gauche. So, you could make an argument that they take some of that stuff a little lightly when they're playing with it.
Yeah, they do sort of, but it's, I mean, some of that is, and I guess this could also be a criticism, is that because red and blue are time hopping soldiers, and they have that sort of perspective that you get as a historian of, well, everyone's gonna, everyone involved in this story is long dead anyway. But of course they have that with every time that they're living in. And so, they do have a very sort of casual approach to every death that isn't, theirs or the other ones.
Indeed.
I suppose, so that could, I guess, be a turnoff if you really want your characters to have, like, an obvious, strong moral compass from the get-go. Or just if you want, I guess, these issues treated with a little bit deeper engagement.
Yes. Clearly not a priority for either of us in this instance.
No. And, I will say, I don't normally like time travel stories because I think that they either tend to be nonsensical or overly precious. But this one does actually, I think, make a lot of the time travel stuff work because, again, the construction is so good.
Agreed.
So normally I would say don't read this if you don't like time travel stories. But I don't really like time travel stories, and I still enjoyed this one.
Yeah, no, it's not annoying in the way that time travel stories generally are, in large part because it's dealing actively with multiverse theory while it goes. So, content warnings, torture, genocide, murder, all, total war across timelines, no sexual assault, at least, that I can think of. it's war. Bad things happen.
It is war, bad things happen, and yet, like a lot of fantasy stories about war, I feel like there's two ways that fantasy writers tackle war and, gray morality, and one is to put way too much sexual assault in for, like, the titillation, and the other is to, like, pretend that it never happens because we are willing to empathize with a mass murderer. We are not willing to empathize with a rapist.
I guess that actually both of the characters sexually seduce their murder victims under false pretenses in here. I don't know if that counts.
That is true.
But yeah, those are your content warnings, ladies and gentlemen, minus the one that we inevitably think of 20 minutes into the next section of the podcast.
Yes.
Suicidal ideation, suicidal ideation, suicidal ideation, that is the thing we missed. Shall we move on?
Well, the kind of editing that you're able to do after the fact is kind of like time travel. And thus it will be thematically appropriate if we indeed have to go splice in some later content warnings that we think of 20 minutes later.
An excellent point. Shall we move on to the spoiler zone?
Let's.
All right. Spoiler zone. Why not? So yeah, I think it's pretty. We have the luxury of having read both of these authors before for this podcast, and also not
it's
for
true.
this podcast. So it seemed to be really obvious that red was Max Gladstone and blue was Amal. Or Mal.
Right.
Rather.
I mean, among other things, because blue makes cracks about Canada and red keeps talking about China. But apparently, I am told that apparently the cover is supposed to be a clue, and whose name is closer is supposed to be who wrote what, and then Amal al-Motar is right next to red, and Max Gladstone is next to the bluebird or the blue jay.
I don't buy it. So it's a blue herring.
Isaac made another joke.
Yeah, I really don't either. I mean, unless they're like going out of their way to mimic the other, because also like red reads more like Max Gladstone and blue reads more like Amal al-Motar.
Yeah, I mean,
they did apparently write the they co-wrote the narrative bits.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. But of course, authors being dead and all that's just us having fun, looking for fingerprints in the prose.
Apparently, I've looked it up on Wikipedia, and indeed, Red's letters were written entirely by Gladstone and Blue's by al-Motar.
Of course,
so.
Come on. There's, I feel Gladstone's fingerprints in the settings in multiverse, sort of more SF style, and it should be pretty clear if you've read either of their stuff.
Yes.
But that was an interesting wrinkle, since the first time I read this book, I had previously read neither of their. I'd read neither of their works. I'd certainly never read any of Amal's stuff. So.
Oh, interesting. I was the other way around. When I read it, I picked it up and I had read some of Amal's short fiction and really liked it, but I'd never read Empress of Forever. I read Empress of Forever partly on the strength of Time War.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
And I did not read Time War for like the first year after it came out, because nobody bothered to mention to me that the warring time travelers who fall in love were lesbians.
Well, that might be a good segue into one of the things that I wanted to talk about. In this being a Queer Desires the Revolutionary Moment story or not. Because both of these entities, red and blue.
Both of these entities shapeshift into a variety of different bodies of different genders.
Neither of them were born, in the way that human beings are born. They're both like far future.
I mean, I believe that Blue was born because, she has like parents.
Yeah, that's true.
She was like, she was like genetically engineered, but she was still, it is implied that she was still, born. Red was that grown, but
either way, like their initial gender or genital configurations. Well, for Blue more than Red actually, because Blue would have had a childhood at some point where she grew up as a girl, in some past where that would have mattered, but.
Right, versus Red, who grew up as one body in a vat surrounded by a bunch of other bodies in a vat, and the main thing that distinguished her from the other bodies is that she wanted to get out of her vat and, experience having a body. But
it's a common theme throughout all of this, wacky, wild, prehistoric, post-historic, alternate reality mess is that they're both definitely her and she. And
even when they're in male bodies,
and there aren't really any agender characters or non-binary characters either anywhere else that they encounter. Everybody has the pronouns, male or female, even if that is sort of gone by the wayside in terms of the utility of that as a concept.
Yes, though we say male or female, but really everybody has female pronouns except for some of the men in the past.
Right. So the implication may be that everybody is just her after a while.
Which is, very Imperial Ratch.
Yeah. Very sort of... I've definitely read some more serious speculative fiction about, how we'll do away with men eventually. From certain quarters. But... regardless, being a woman is very important to both of these people beyond the point where that would have any practical, reason. And there's no cultural, all of the forbidden romance here is that they're from these two different sides, not because they're both women.
Right.
But it seems very important that they're both women.
Right. Well, I think to some degree because... this is because stories of forbidden love are extreme, don't have to be, but we touched on this before with The Unbroken. The idea that when you want to write a queer story that in a world without homophobia, but you still want it to be a story that resonates with contemporary queer readers, you have to find some other barrier.
Yes, this, of course,
being on opposite sides of the time war.
Being the biggest barrier of them all. Yeah. And of course, one of the oldest barriers of them all. And the book explicitly is like, hey, this is kind of like Romeo and Juliet, isn't it? Except, we're, thousands of years old rather than teenagers. But Blue, I think, is the one who goes to the theater to see Romeo and Juliet without knowing whether this is one of the timelines where it's a comedy or one of the timelines where it's a tragedy, which I
really love.
It's beautiful. It's a great piece of foreshadowing also because it casts doubt on the book itself.
Right.
The book is telling you, don't assume that we're going to have a happy ending here, which is nice, even though obviously you kind of know that we're going to have a happy ending.
But in some realities,
right,
time war ends tragically.
Exactly. But we were one of the lucky ones where they managed to sort of break the rules and get away. We assume at the very end. Let's see here. Speaking of the title, there is something to be said about the use of the second person in this book. First of all, in the title, this is how you lose the time war. Second, in the dedication, this book is for you. Yes, you. No, we're talking to you. And then in sort of near the end where Red is sort of haphazardly killing a you, it is doing sort of violence to somebody in the second person in a way that I didn't entirely get. So is this book is there kind of a middle finger to, the man in that you, do you think? Is the you, the culture?
I'm pretty sure that the you is the queer readers. in the dedication and stuff.
Well, but this is how you lose the Time War, and they win it.
See, I don't know, because most of the book they're talking to each other, and and admittedly they're saying this is how we win the Time War.
Right.
I mean, I like that as sort of a counter narrative, but the people who are reading Time War, it is to be assumed, are the people who they don't want to give the middle finger to.
Yeah, no, I that was my initial assumption upon seeing that dedication. But I think that I would want to, if I were to go back and read this book for a third time, I would want to do so, because this only occurred to me at the very end, to go back and read it and pay very special attention to the time that you is used outside of the letters, when they're not addressing each other, but when it's the narrator addressing perhaps an audience. Because that does happen a few times. I remember it's kind of jarring when it happens.
I somehow completely missed that. I mean, now I'm really curious.
Yeah, I might be making this up.
I looked through the book to find what I was talking about, but I can't find what I was talking about, so sorry for wasting your time.
I should point out that the audiobook did not include the acknowledgments at the end, which is a shame. This is a book club favorite and has discussion topics in the back in this edition.
Wow.
Which is very exciting.
Isn't it kind of great that we now live in a world where, like, queer spec fic is sufficiently every day that people are, will talk about it in a book club?
True. Also, this has an author photo of the both of them carrying swords, which is just incredibly adorable.
It's adorable. Yes, my ebook has it too.
Mm-hmm. But anyway, back to the subject in hand. So yeah, I don't know. Put that in the book club question, section for future discussion. I did feel like part of the charm of the book was it very much is an us against the world book, right?
Right.
In this case, it's literally them against the entire known multiverse, because all strands of the multiverse are controlled by either one side or the other. And so it was interesting to me to think about, like, who are they talking to outside that system, or are they addressing that system, or are they inviting other people to join their rebellion, which, like, obviously that is what they're doing. But yeah, no, it also struck me, since I picked the book up, how this book has apparently, caught on with people. There were lots and lots of copies of this edition with the book club stuff in the back available to buy at Powell's. This might be one of the more, popular in the mainstream books that we've covered, unscientifically.
I have no idea, but that would not surprise me. It's because even though it's dealing with time travel, it's less genre-y, I think, than a lot of them.
It's very poetic, yeah. And you don't have to, like, understand any of what's going on with the science fiction side of it, really. You can just sort of let it wash over you, because the point, as we've mentioned, is the romance rather than the world building. Although I think there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in the world building.
There is.
I liked the fact that, one is tempted by the, red versus blue thing, and the fact that one of them are robots and one of them are plants, to think of it, to sort of read it as a, East versus West conflict, or, a male versus female conflict, or capitalism
man versus nature.
Right, exactly. Something along those lines. Those symbols being, as determined as they are. But in the end, it really seems like both of these societies are really similar. They're both, like, collectivist in the, getting subsumed into the collective thing that, we have discussed a lot, particularly in the earlier books that we were talking about for the podcast. It's, there was this preoccupation of being dissolved into the whole, as,
Right. And that's one of the ways, I think, in which the Garden and the Commandant / the Chaos Oracle, the red Team Red and Team Blue, work as wizard figures, is because, they are already immortal and not particularly I guess in some ways they are still obsessed with their own immortality because, I mean, what's, like kind of the ultimate immortality is creating the time stream that allows you to be
inevitable.
Is being well, right. It's basically, it's you're being immortal backwards and forwards throughout all time. And sort of locking that down, even though there's a million time streams and like they both exist simultaneously and yet they can't stop fighting.
It is, yeah. And it's sort of interesting because it's like, it is the logical, in both cases, it's the logical extension of the totalitarian mindset because, they're attempting to lock down their own pasts like this is,
right.
Basically assuring that not only can there never be a threat to their civilization, but there never could have been a threat to their civilization. So even the idea of revolution having existed or being a possibility is being expunged retroactively. Which is why what Red and Blue are doing is so, crazy and unforgivable for both sides. Yeah.
And I mean, I do feel like, and this is going to depend a lot personality to personality, I feel like Blue's side ends up coming off still slightly more appealing. I'm sure that I know part of that's my own personal, inclinations, right? Is I'd much rather be the side that gets to eat honey than the side that, has eliminated hunger. But at this, and I'm sure that there are singularity people who would disagree otherwise. But to some degree, Max Gladstone, as we can tell from Empress of Forever, is somebody who's really skeptical of singularity utopias.
Oh yeah, no, this is what I was going to point out that, the reason that, Max Gladstone Red's, future is that it's the logical endpoint of the Silicon Valley priesthood, because that's sort of what his preoccupation is. Boy, that picture of him tells you that.
Yeah, but it's interesting because like you look at the picture of him wearing the sunglasses and the sword and you think this could be like a Neil Stephenson wannabe, but
no, he's undercutting it.
Right, is that all of, is that so much of his writing is clearly somebody who sees the appeal of that, vision and also sees the like fundamental creative and moral bankruptcy at its heart.
Yeah. You could, if we're going to do this for him, it's only fair that we do this for Amal.
Right.
And, it's sort of the logical extension of this kind of, the only thing that I've read by her beside this is the fairy tale reimagining, but like
she's written several very good fairy tale reimaginings.
But yeah, no, if you can go further into the sort of hippy dippy woods and end up with the kind of smothering nature mother figure that Garden is, the loving but inescapable, all consuming, vines catching you within her embrace forever mother, at the core of that kind of ideology. Just, just throwing that out
right.
there.
I mean, yeah, right. But I mean, it's also Garden comes off being more appealing. Like if you had to pick, obviously you don't want to live in either of these worlds, but if you had to pick one, clearly you do want the one that I think, you can taste delicious food in.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, it's like Blue just seems to be having a better time.
She does.
And Garden seems to be having a much better time than the Commandant, who seems to be like exhausted and upset and is also, when we see Commandant, she's like just sort of offhandedly torturing somebody with a body that she doesn't really remember how to use, and she's not even enjoying it,
Right, and she's just like covered in blood and stressed out. Right. And like the one time we see Garden, she and Blue are having tea and like sort of half flirting, winking at each other.
Right.
And being oh so clever.
And you're gonna, inevitably gonna come down on like whose prose style or whose sort of worldview you enjoy more, and
right. And like I don't think it's an insult to Max Gladstone to call him, I think, the less talented half of this book. Like I still enjoy his writing quite a bit.
Right.
But
I should mention though that I do like some of the things that he's thrown in here quite a lot.
Oh yeah, no, like he's clearly having a lot of fun, and it really comes through. But despite the fact that Garden, I think, comes off as much more appealing, and Blue comes off as a much more appealing figure, partly because she's got a little bit more freedom to diverge from Garden in a way that like Red doesn't really from the hive mind. But they make a point of showing the places where, you know, where Garden is still committing horrible atrocities, because it's, when it comes down to it, it doesn't actually, even if one is more pleasant to live than the other, they're both committing horrible atrocities. And, you know, you can't escape that, whether you're living in a viney, hivey elf world, as
right,
as Red says, or in like what Blue calls it, a techie mechie dystopia.
Yes. And you know, and it is interesting, as I mentioned before, that, you know, some of these atrocities on both sides are of the, gosh, wouldn't it be great if I could go back in time and change this and that, and, you know, thus prevent this atrocity from happening by replacing it with another atrocity, kind of a deal. And
sometimes they're not even atrocities. Though I will note that, and this is clearly a Max Gladstone insert, the whole setting up the Trans-Pacific trade, you know, thus allowing the Ming Dynasty not to fall. The Ming Dynasty was terrible.
Yeah, no, I know.
They put the eunuchs in charge of the secret police.
I'm sure that Max also knows.
Right, no, exactly. But I mean, that's the sort of thing that if you're reading this with that sort of, you know, Tumblr-y, only Western empires are bad, or for that matter, if you're reading this as, you know, a like hardcore restore the monarchy, restore the, you know, the imperial monarchy, Chinese monarchist, which they do exist, you know, you could read that as a happy alternate future. But the Ming was awful.
Yes.
I mean, not that the Qing, which replaced it and which I have a great deal of fondness for, was actually better, but at least they did away with the, you know, punishing every member of your family out to like the 5th, you know, degree of mourning or whatever.
Indeed. And we've for more on that, check out She Who Became the Sun.
Well, She Who Became the Sun is mostly about, you know, how the Ming comes to be. So,
but you know, imagine the kind of empire that she would have founded. But anyway, yeah, the spin-off that I was going to do is that one of the things that I appreciate about Max's contributions here is not only does he undercut some of the more highfalutin stuff with the terrible puns, for example, and the 90s cultural references, which is great. But actually, one of those 90s cultural references leads to, I think, my favorite thing in the entire book. And that 90s cultural reference is a reference to The Sandman, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes! I remember you mentioning this the first time you read this book.
Yes.
Is the whole, like, Socrates. Yes, the fact that Red's formative moment comes from reading a Sandman comic.
I mean, I feel seen. What is there to say?
Right? No, exactly. Like, I feel like this is, you know, a quintessential weirdo, 90s weirdo teen moment, and thus helps cement this book as, you know, queer literature.
Right.
Not that you have to be or have been queer to have been a weirdo teen in the 90s, but you know, it didn't hurt.
I agree. But my favorite thing about the book is the way that they both go back and save each other as kids.
Yes.
Because you know, that's, you know, your classic time travel trope. Right. But B, like I think it works on like a pretty straightforward first order metaphorical level really well. Like,
right, because like you could go back, there's the fantasy of what if you could go back and save the Aztec Empire, but there's also the fantasy of what if you could go back and save yourself as a teenager in an abusive household, or save your significant other as like a depressed and suicidal teenager.
Exactly. Like, and then the answer to the question is, okay, so you're a depressed and suicidal teenager, you've read The Sandman, you're going to be like Socrates, and you're going to go out into the wild and stare into space all night. We've been there. I've been there.
You've been there.
Yeah. And there's like two different outcomes to that sort of literal long dark night of the soul, right? You can either turn back toward life, or you can turn away from life, either in the most drastic way, or in a way that leads you to sort of
nihilism.
Yeah, falling apart in one way or another.
Yeah,
and,
self nihilism or self-destruction or
yeah,
whatever.
And this book is saying, well, in the most literal way, what's one thing that brings you back from the brink? It's the idea that there might be somebody who loves you.
Yes, and the idea that there might be some that like. It gets better, right? It's the idea that you think that you will be alone and isolated your entire life. And if only we could go back and tell our teenage selves, or, their friends or significant others' teenage selves, no, this is how much better your life is going to be. Just like stick it out another 5 to 20 years.
Yeah. Without mentioning Dan Savage at all, just because who needs that surus to bring Dan Savage into the conversation? Yet I've done it completely unprompted. But anyway,
yeah, I guess I did mention the It Gets Better project, but you're the one who brought Dan Savage into it.
That aside, let's go back in time and tell Dan Savage a few things to not do. Slash say, but.
So
I've lost my train of thought now.
But yes, I agree that is. But at the same time, they do that, and just like messing with the past, messing with the past in a grand civilizational scale is not a great idea. I mean, they go back in time to save each other, except that they're going back in time to save each other from each other.
Yes.
Like, Blue goes back, like, Blue has been sent to kill Teenage Red, and, she saves Red from her own assassination plan. Red goes back to save Blue from having poisoned Blue.
Yeah.
By permanently alienating Blue from, slightly from, sowing the seeds of their eventual revolution.
Yeah, I mean, and this is why, as wizards, we call this a wizard versus lesbians novel, because these lesbians are wizards and are both working for the wizards. That they function as agents of the culture, and in the first place.
Interestingly, much like Empress of Forever,
yes.
This is another case. This is another story of the wizards. The wizards, who are incidentally also lesbians, becoming liberated from their own, from being liberated from the wizard within by, as usual, the revolutionary force of queer desire.
Right.
But in this case, it's mostly just the revolutionary force of love. It's a good classic, like, love conquers all type thing.
Yeah,
including
definitely.
the wizard within.
There's a question of how much physical desire can apply to entities like this. But yes. They seem to be mostly another thing about the book that I appreciate is that where in a letter to a flesh and blood person you might be passionate about their physical attributes, they're passionate about the other person's signifiers.
Viciousness.
Well,
yes.
There is that, but there's also just their conceptual framework is, it's like, ooh, I like the red of your redness, red.
Right.
Ooh, your blueness is so blue,
Yes. Well, so actually, though, this leads me to another sort of useful queer theme in this story. Because part of why they get really into picking metaphors and references and things that are that color when they're thinking about the other one, is because, they're subject to mind reading,
yes.
from their wizardly overlords. But again, this is actually a really good metaphorical thing for, dealing with, this is like the way, the dealing with both kind of the internalized first disbelief and then fear of sort of internal rejection that you go through when you're coming to grips with the fact that you're not straight.
Yeah.
First there's the haha, this is funny, and then they sort of start to let down their guard a bit, and then they both go, no, actually we're going to win still. We're still on, they remind, like, right before they admit that they're in love, they remind each other that no, our team is still winning.
Yeah.
That sort of denial, and then even when they've admitted to themselves, they still aren't quite letting themselves think about it flat out. That's, they think about the other person as sky or berries or whatever.
Segue.
I'm just going to share a couple of random notes that I enjoyed.
Okay.
Feathered dinosaurs, 2 thumbs up.
Always.
Good bird lore.
Always classic.
I appreciate it. The way that there's a lot of talk about how blue and the garden side sort of push gradually and work slowly through history, where red darts back and forth like a needle, is excellent foreshadowing of red darting back and forth through time like a needle, sewing up blue's pieces by collecting all of the parts. That's, again, this book has way more structure and like attention to sort of internal rhyming and detail than it needs to have, which is great. Really kicks it up to that next level. And let's see here. I think that's pretty much all that I've got. Do you have any other?
I like the little side point about Shakespeare whether Shakespeare is a tragedy or comedy is going to totally depend on your timeline. Whether Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy or comedy is totally going to depend on your timeline. That's not only a nice bit, it also does, allow you to have fun imagining other Shakespeare plays, and some of which could really easily have flipped into being a tragedy or a comedy.
Ooh, The Taming of the Shrew.
Yeah, or Much Ado About Nothing.
Yeah.
All you got to do is just, end it a little earlier. On the other hand, I like that Travel Light is the same in every time in which it appears.
We were going to have to mention that.
Right. Because
clearly a book that is as important to the which of the authors brings it up first?
I don't recall, but they both. I'm sure it must be Blue who brings it up, because it's Blue's kind of thing.
It feels like one of them recommends the book to the other, which feels like one of the authors. Hey, have you read this?
Right.
Oh shit, exactly. This is so good. It's like, but I didn't get this one little part. But yeah, in case anybody's wondering, that's a real book. It's also very short and very good and totally worth reading.
And it's also a time travel story.
Yeah, exactly. So,
yes, Blue is the one who recommends Travel Light to Red, and they have a whole little discussion in the letters about the Constantinople bit, which and how they both found the Constantinople bit a little bit hard to grapple with.
Travel Light by Naomi Mitchison's a book about a woman who travels from the Dark Ages to Constantinople, interacting with the myths of every time. It's very good, but hard to describe, so if you want to know what Blue was trying to communicate with Constantinople, you should read it for yourself.
Because Travel Light is another time travel story that I actually enjoy. Partly because it, like This Is How You Lose the Time War, isn't just a story about traveling through a self-contained time period. It's about traveling through sort of different narrative realities.
Yeah, indeed. And to sort of twist that, one of the things that I liked, one of the obvious things that I like about this book is that the love letters feel like, real love letters. And, part of that is, sharing really important, bits and pieces of media, or really important bits of, your history with the other person, or there was another one, but I've forgotten what it was. Oh yeah, the leaning on shared memory as a way of sort of recontextualizing and reconstructing a new world out of mutual experience.
Right, even though a lot of their mutual experience is just like catching a glimpse of the other one across a battlefield.
I mean, and yeah, what's more romantic than that? You know, these
right.
these
No,
little
I mean,
flashes
this is
of memory.
definitely if you want your enemies to lovers story.
Yeah.
But right, and I mean, but also, you know, there's the sort of the ways in which they're learning about themselves through writing about themselves to the other person. That I thought came, you know, was very. I thought that also came across to be sort of very human and well depicted.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree.
And yeah, so here's an interesting comparison: is how do we feel like this stacks up against our other alternate timeline book that we've done?
Which one would that be?
The Space Between
Space
Worlds,
Between Worlds,
which is another favorite of ours.
It is, yes, which we keep forgetting to mention for some reason. I mean, it's like it's a very, very, very different sort of political viewpoint.
It is, yes. Though I think Kara, in some ways, and all the time jump, the world jumpers, in Space Between Worlds, kind of have that same half invested, half distance, you know, deliberately distanced relationship with all the worlds that they're hopping around through.
Yeah, no, there is that. They do. The books do both like deal with the process of individuation, in the same way, and the tension of like what an identity means when it's so far removed from a like an actual heritage, like when you're such a sort of political agent or tool that you've been removed from whatever context that you were brought up in so thoroughly that you no longer have any real relation to it, even if you seem to be right in it.
Yeah, but at the same time, Red and Blue, Kara is really concerned with and, you know, invested in figuring out how, you know, trying to relate to people in each reality as individuals while also trying to like compare them and disentangle them from their other reality counterparts. And Red and Blue really aren't. They're just like, wait, Socrates, I wonder if we knew the same ones.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's part of what I mean by like the Space Between Worlds functions on like a level of individual tragedy and, you know, cares about the deaths in it in a way that this book is like, these people are so jaded and beyond that. I mean, what they have is the solipsism of lovers, like the or the narcissism of lovers, I should say. I've been pulled up on the distinction between those two words recently. That they really, you know, that's the thing about the two of us against the world, is that you really don't care about how difficult you're making things for anybody else, you know. And so
right, and I mean, there's also, they take the same attitude towards history, towards the people in history, that we do, even when they're there in it, because everything to them is history, except their own personal timelines and interactions, and, you know, and the other people on their
and even
sides.
those, because they've lived so long, they're, you know, particularly Blue, I guess, they're, you know, they're removed from so much of this stuff by so much history,
right? But, you know, but like, they take their own feelings seriously, and again, you know, the loss of the other one they take very seriously, but you know, there's that sort of casualness, and it is interesting because when you're reading when you're reading, historical fiction or even like a really well written sort of very narrative biography, then it's easy to get caught up in these individual lives. But when you're reading it sort of as bigger sweep of history, or when you've just been reading like a lot of case files or a lot of, historical letters or whatever, it is really easy to get jaded.
Yeah. And I also think that, like, and this is a distinction between this and Space Between Worlds, is that the actor in the Space Between Worlds is coming at it from the perspective of the underclass. Like the protagonist of the Space Between Worlds is one of the people who is being mowed down,
Yes.
Whereas
quite literally
these
by
are
trucks.
Right. Whereas these are both essentially like aristocrats in these societies, to the extent that these people are both coming from milieu of extreme privilege and sort of view the casualties in the same way that you, as an army general, you do view your own casualties. Not cold-hearted necessarily, but sort of like c'est la guerre,
but dehumanized.
Yeah.
And it is interesting that Blue can live an entire life and like marry and have either kids or nieces and nephews or whatever, and still throughout it have this complete sort of detachment.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to look at like what the actual horror of Garden is, that might be a clue toward it.
Yeah.
The sheer indifference of a mortal lifespan from something that huge and slow and ancient.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think about about the whole like Blue deciding that she's going to, actually, come to think of it, there's our forgotten trigger warning, which is there's some suicidal ideation.
All right.
There's some suicidal ideation.
We almost got away from there.
What do you think of this whole Red agrees to murder Blue, but tells her not, but like writes in this warning, except that obviously she's not going to listen to the whole letter of please stop reading this letter. That
was the one part of the book where I felt that Max had been asked to do something that was slightly punching above weight. If we're going to get into the bits that annoyed us now, since it's about the time.
Great, perfect segue
to get into that point.
And this is the place where we'd start to complain, but there's very little here to complain about.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, we were aiming for like sort of high Shakespearean tragedy there, right? And we did not quite hit it, I don't think. Further in, when sort of Red is doing the appeal to their shared experience and being like, and talking about the memories that they're sharing, I thought that it worked better, but I can understand the wanting to read that next letter from your lover so badly that you'll fool yourself into thinking that it's not 100% true that it'll actually kill you bit. I can, that seems real.
It does. I mean, I guess it's also just if you want, because it's kind of in the context of Red's, saying we shouldn't be talking anymore.
Right.
And like, if you want to sort of read it on a more metaphorical level, it does kind of have that thing of you've gotten your no, we can't talk anymore, and you've sent your very brief that's fine, fine if that's what you want.
Yeah.
And then you get another letter and it's gonna just make you sad.
Yeah.
And so to some degree it doesn't have to be a beautiful letter. It doesn't have to be a letter that is so beautiful that you will follow it to its death, because the thing, the letters that something doesn't actually have to be beautiful to hurt you.
Yeah, definitely. It is. I mean, this feels universally relatable. I mean, I don't know if it is actually universally relatable, but I can certainly relate to that. getting that email in your inbox from the person who, you thought would never speak to you again, and knowing that clicking on it is not necessarily a great idea for a lot of reasons, but you're absolutely going to, no matter what, even if you never acknowledge it. And even if you really didn't want to know what there was inside it or whatever. Mm-hmm. So yeah, no, it felt emotionally true. Just the sort of, I'm begging you not to read this letter. Don't do it. Bit.
Right. It didn't. I agree that it didn't quite come off.
The execution left a little to be desired.
I read it and I was like, you know what? You really shouldn't be reading this letter.
Yeah. Are you sure this is worth it? But yes. But yeah, on a larger level it worked. And I also really liked the, the sort of mirror of that was swallowing the seeds one by one, even though it was, making her sick to do so. Mm-hmm. I like that sort of, when you're that deep into it, the, reading these things can hurt as much as they can, mm-hmm. as much as they can be, it's, you go into that sort of pain and pleasure sort of matrix at that point, and then really stupid things start to seem like they make sense, like, assisted suicide. With a magical win condition at the end of it.
Yes. At which point, so then, so they've had their nasty breakup. So are we sold on how that all fixes, on how they fix it back up, they stitch it back up together?
As far as like, magical rule breaking goes, like within the narrative of the book, yes, because it's set up so hard, and because I like the way that you think the Seeker is this malevolent presence for half of the book until you start to cotton on.
Right.
And on a sort of metaphorical level, yeah, I think that it's, I think that it is possible to, it's the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, right? Like, when you're, and like the end point of that in real life is generally not, let's renew our vows. This was, a good idea all the time. It can be, we've reconstructed this relationship in a new way.
I do think it's really interesting that their perfect fantasy ending is to be neighbors.
Yes. I really appreciate that. As somebody who's never really enjoyed the idea of sharing a bedroom, I appreciate that.
Right, but that it's not, they either can't or don't want to imagine a life where they're, despite the fact they're having this incredibly intense, I will be, I dare you to let me infect you,
right.
kind of romance.
Well, they come from these cultures that are like so invasive, and like, their ego boundaries are being, demolished by their mind reading superiors at all times. So it's just like the idea of having a lover that you're actually separate from, but then you can go visit to commune intentionally with, is like the height of luxury for them. Yeah.
Right. But, but it does also sort of leave some space for, is what they want even like a permanent romance, or is what they want just like some peace?
Yeah, is what they want is to, and that goes into the sort of, war letters thing, which is not something that we've really talked about, but this is also, there's also the sort of Civil War harmonica over a documentary actor narrating a letter to my dearest Beatrice thing going on here a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Well, as really most epistolary fiction has.
Yes. That, really the thing that you want to do at the end of the war is not so much have a romance that is as intense as the war was, but to just like fucking put your feet up and walk on the beach.
Yeah. And,
have a normal life. Or as close to a normal life as entities like this can, aspire to have.
Despite the fact that in the war letters, usually that's explicit, that is generally what's dwelled on, even, the sort of comfort aspect of the relationship is dwelled on.
But the idea that that is like even an option for them is part of like the discovery of it, Right,
but I mean, even at the very end, like when they're saying maybe we can become neighbors and have tea, they're still, Blue is still also like, still using teeth and claws and poisoned apples and betrayal as the main metaphors to talk about Red.
I mean, yeah, but that's what gets her off. I mean, they're still definitely fucking in this scenario. I mean, let's be real.
Right, but that I feel like that's something of an unresolved tension in the book, and I don't think that's a bad thing. Mm. But that that is something that is clearly unresolved in their relationship, is that they can't think, and they touch on this briefly, is that they can't think about each other in peaceful terms, even though what they want is peace. And it does kind of make, the book kind of leaves it open to whether or not they're actually going to be able to have the kind of peace that they want.
I think that the chances of them not immediately turning around and mutually waging war on the entirety of both of these civilizations are very slim.
Right.
That's a lot. That's a lot of thousands of years of ingrained habit to break to actually retire.
Yeah. And because people actually have a lot of trouble breaking out of these systems.
Yeah.
And I end the book, very invested in their romance and in the idea that they could have peace, not actually convinced that they're like emotionally ready for it.
Agreed. But also it's on the time scale of what their lives have been. This has been a whirlwind romance.
Yes. Yes, this has been a whirlwind romance, despite the fact that it takes place over
multiple
centuries.
Lifetimes. Yes, exactly. Well, I think I'm content to leave it there. I think that we did.
I don't really have any. I don't really actually have anything that seriously annoyed me about the book. So
nor do I. This is a really good one, and it's really short. I mean, just go ahead and pick it up.
Just read it if you haven't already. I mean, be a little surprised if there's that many people listening to the podcast who haven't. But if you haven't, you should.
Yep.
Seriously, it'll just take you an afternoon, if that.
It's an 8-hour audiobook. It's a 200-page book with giant text. And by massive contrast, next time around we will be talking about the Priory of the Orange Tree,
which certainly is not short.
Which is literally 3 times as long as this book. I think maybe 4 times actually. No, it's 4 times as long as this book.
How long is the audiobook?
25 hours, and this one was like 6 and change actually. Now that I think about it.
All right then.
This audiobook was actually 4 hours long, not 6 or 8 as I previously said, and Priory is 26 hours long, so it's actually 6.5 times longer. I'm about halfway through reading it now, and I have fewer notes than I did for the entirety of this book. Wow.
But I should mention that I'm still enjoying it.
I'm glad.
It's scratching an itch that I have not had scratched in a very long time. Which is
it's that classic '90s brick.
Yeah, it's what it.
It's a real throwback to
you
the
could stun a
good old
burglar with
bricks.
this thing.
Right. Leora, apparently, I've learned from my girlfriend that apparently these are called on Reddit cat squashers, which I think is unfair because I put because it's only like 700 pages or whatever, and I put all like 900 pages of the current Steerswoman books on top of my cat, and she was mostly just confused.
Yeah, I imagine that in this A, those are paperbacks, and B, I imagine that
well, I was going to try putting like 4 volumes of the Jewish Encyclopedia, but Leora wouldn't let me.
I think we're imagining these falling off a table or something, but regardless, rather than going into, cat
actual
death
cat
scenarios, that's what we'll be discussing next week, or 2 weeks from now. And I somehow think that I'm going to have less to say about that book than I did about this much, much shorter one, but we'll find out.
It will be fun to see, but
Indeed.
I think that's possible, yes.
All right. Until then.
Bye.
Bye-bye.